Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy. And I actually want to talk to you about an article published in The Economist written by a Russian called Alexandra Prokopenko. And this article is entitled Russia's Economy Has Entered the Death Zone. Now, in terms of who's Alexandra Prokopenko and is she qualified to actually talk about Russia? Well, she's a former advisor of the Central Bank of Russia, a former member of Russia's monetary policy team, and therefore has a lot of credibility as she's worked inside the Russian monetary system, understands reserves, fiscal flows, and state banking, and the impact of sanctions. So, this is not just speculative commentary, it's coming from someone who has seen the machinery from inside. Now, the title Russia has entered the death zone actually refers to a climbing term. The death zone is the altitude above 8,000 meters, which is 26,000 feet. And it's only found on a small number of mountains around the world. Mount Everest and K2 are probably the most famous. Oxygen levels are only one third of what they are at sea level. Air pressure is dramatically lower, and the human body cannot acclimatize permanently. So cells begin to die, muscle tissue breaks down, brain function deteriorates. Fluid can accumulate in the lungs and swelling can occur in the brain. So, even when you're resting, your body is deteriorating. And that's why climbers can move slowly, avoid sleeping there, and descend as soon as possible, as soon as they reach the summit. So, how long can a climber survive in the death zone? Well, there's no exact time limit, but most climbers spend less than 16 to 20 hours there. Some expeditions may remain for up to 24 to 48 hours, but the risks then increase dramatically. And beyond 48 hours, well, the survival odds are dropping sharply. Nobody can stay for weeks in the death zone. You pass through it, you do not stay there. So, in this article, Russia's economy has entered the death zone. Essentially, the author is comparing the Russian economy at the moment to a climber that's above 8,000 meters in altitude. So essentially, it's saying that the Russian economy cannot survive. It's existing at the moment, but it's deteriorating, it's burning internal reserves, and something needs to happen to save the Russian economy because if it carries on as it is at the moment, it will consume itself. Now, just before we go on any further today, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, NordVPN, who I've actually been working with for a very long time. Now, NordVPN is an online protection system, and you might not think that you need one, but if you use Wi Fi when you go out and about, if you use Wi Fi in stores or hotels or anywhere that you go, you're opening yourself up to potentially being hacked because hackers prey on people who are using Wi Fi. And unless you have some sort of protection, you're opening up your passwords and your accounts to potentially being hacked. There's lots of different things that can happen to you when you're using online Wi Fi. But by using NordVPN, you'll have total protection. Its Threat Protection Pro will give you the protection that you need to make sure that nobody can steal your passwords or take any money from you. And it will also protect you when you're shopping online and doing basically anything. And the great news is that it's not just about protection. It can also open up lots of opportunities for you because you can change your location and access deals that might not be available in your region. And you can also watch entertainment and sports matches and things that are blocked from a geopolitical perspective. So it is a fantastic product. That's why I've been working with these guys for so long. And the great news is that Joe Blogs viewers can get an additional 4 months extra on a subscription, which you can access by going to nordvpn.com/Joe Blogs or clicking the link in the description below. Now, in answering the question as to how the Russian economy is surviving in the death zone at the moment, the author has said that it's split itself into two distinct metabolic systems, the military core and the civilian periphery. So the military core, we've talked about this many times on the channel before, is basically all of the companies that are now helping with the war in Ukraine. So the Kremlin is sponsoring a lot of these businesses. It's paying them directly to produce things that are needed to keep the war effort going. And this is basically the switch to the wartime economy. So this is focused on defense. State funding is going to all of those businesses. They've got guaranteed contracts. and civilian businesses have basically been cut off. They've been left to their own devices. And those companies are severely struggling at the moment because of the sanctions that are in place. So, obviously, if you're an exporter in Russia, you've lost access to many of the markets that you were previously selling into. And also, in terms of sourcing raw materials and other items, you're also struggling to be able to do that. So, essentially, what the author's saying here is that the Russian economy is prioritizing the military core and has cut off the civilian periphery. So, this is basically like the human body. It would keep the vital organs going whilst you're in the death zone above 8,000 meters, and all the periphery would start to be cut off. So, your fingers and toes and things like that would start losing circulation. And that's essentially what's happening in the Russian economy. The defense sector and all the defense related industries are all doing okay because they're being funded by the Kremlin. Everything else is slowly starting to die. So the article goes on to highlight that all of the growth that's coming out of Russia at the moment is war growth. So manufacturing growth over the past 3 years has been over 18%, 18.3%. But unfortunately, the flip side of that is that civilian production is shrinking whilst defense production is expanding. And this is really distorting the whole of the Russian economy. And if it carries on for the long term, there is going to be some fundamental damage that will be inflicted on Russia's civilian businesses. Now, as we've talked about many times over the past few years, Russia has been dependent on oil and gas. That's basically how it built its economy. It sold energy products to the rest of the world, and those energy products are now under severe pressure. And this article has highlighted the fact that oil and gas budget revenues were down by half in January year on year. So Russia is now seeing lower export receipts, continued price discounts. It's having to cut the price of its oil and gas and other energy products to encourage countries like China and India to take the risk of buying those products because they're running the risk of being hit with secondary sanctions. So global demand for Russian products is now weaker than it has been for a very long time. And we've got rising spending at the same time as falling revenue. So this is basically where Russia is now sitting, and that's why the author is saying that it's in the death zone, because the oil and gas revenues were genuine overseas income that Russia was earning from other countries. The article goes on to say that oil rent has now been replaced by military rent. So Russia's economy now runs on what the author is referring to as military rent. So if we talk about the oil rent, which was basically how Russia was operating before, this was genuine external export income. People were buying oil, gas, coal, everything that Russia was selling. That resulted in dollar inflows. So Russia had lots of foreign currency that was coming in from the sale of those items, which it could then use to buy other things that it needed to import. And this basically built up a huge amount of wealth for Russia. That's what happened in the first 20 years of this century. What it's doing now is internally redistributing its wealth. So it's moving money from the Kremlin, it's paying all of these different companies that are producing things for the war efforts in Ukraine, but that doesn't result in any external new capital. So basically, Russia is now consuming itself. It's running down its internal reserves. So the analogy of a climber that's above 8,000 feet is that you're basically burning up your own internal energy whilst you remain at that altitude. And that can't last forever because at some point your internal energy runs out and you die. And that's basically what this article is saying, is that Russia is consuming itself at the moment. It's living off its savings and its wealth that it's built up in the first 20 years of this century. But that can't last forever. It needs some external input. It needs some new capital if it's going to survive. Now, as we've discussed before, the other option that Russia has, rather than spending its own wealth, is to take on more debt. And the article goes on to highlight the fact that in 2026, interest payments on Russian government debt will exceed spending on education and healthcare combined. So the budget deficit is forecast to be 5.6 trillion rubles. And this is resulting in rising borrowing costs, pressure on social spending, and the fiscal budget is now narrowing. So Russia is causing itself problems in the long term because if you start spending more on debt than you're spending on things like healthcare and education, that isn't good for the long-term growth prospects for your economy. Now, in terms of extending this analogy between climbers and the Russian economy, the article goes on to say that a recession is like fatigue. You rest and recover. That's basically what happens. You have a couple of down years when things aren't going so well, and then you bounce back and everything returns to normal. Russia's current situation is altitude sickness. So monetary policy is limited, fiscal stimulus distorted, militarization embedded, and civilian capacity is shrinking. So Russia is basically damaging itself. This isn't like a normal recession where Russia will just carry on as normal once it gets through it. The current situation is causing long-term problems that Russia is really going to struggle to be able to turn around. So how does Russia get itself out of this situation? Well, the article goes on to say that there are 5 conditions for descent. So in the climbing analogy, it's saying to get back down from 8,000 meters of altitude, you need to do 5 things. So it says demobilizing without falling into crisis would require 5 conditions to be met simultaneously. Number 1, credible security guarantees. So basically putting some agreements in place that means that there's not going to be more warfare and fighting going forward. Number 2, mass demobilization and retraining. So basically taking all of the people who are currently fighting in Ukraine back into society. How do you integrate them back into a civilian lifestyle? Number 3, partial sanctions relief. So Russia would need to have some of the sanctions lifted in order to go back to an element of normality. It would need to be able to sell the oil and gas and all of the other exports to countries that are currently refusing to buy it because of the sanctions. Number 4, defense procurement reform. So it would need to change the way defense is working at the moment. And number 5, strong SME absorption capacity. So basically saying that the small businesses in Russia need to be reabsorbed back into the economy because at the moment they've been frozen out. And the article goes on to say that the probability of those 5 things happening simultaneously is near zero. So according to the author, they don't believe that this war is going to come to a conclusion anytime soon. And that's interesting because it states that standard economic theory suggests deteriorating conditions should push the Kremlin towards negotiations. So basically what that's saying is that it makes sense for Russia to try to end this war because the war is severely damaging the Russian economy. But the reason why they don't believe that there will be a conclusion anytime soon is that Russia's view is that Europe is struggling, Ukraine is exhausted, and global growth is slowing. So Russia's perspective is that if they can continue carrying on the war, then ultimately they will win. They will come to a positive outcome. So the Kremlin isn't acknowledging what's happening in the Russian economy. It's not saying that Russia's in the death zone. It's saying, well, as long as we can outlive everybody else, then we will see victory. So in terms of a conclusion, the report asks whether or not Russia can continue living in the death zone. And the conclusion is that Russia can probably continue waging war for the foreseeable future because the war economy is functioning, sort of, the military sector is stabilized and society is adapting. However, structural damage is accumulating. So it doesn't believe that Russia will collapse. But the big question is, what will Russia look like as it comes out of the war in Ukraine eventually? It's going to have a smaller civilian base, a higher debt burden, a militarized industry, and long-term stagnation risk. So the overall summary of this report is that the war in Ukraine, which Russia is now funding from its own internal resources, has seen a huge reduction in revenue, an increase in spending. This is causing long-term damage to the Russian economy. It's now switched to focusing mostly on businesses that are providing things for the war in Ukraine. That's come at the expense of all of its commercial businesses, all of its civilian businesses, all of the businesses that were previously providing all of the income and revenue for Russia for its long-term growth. And ultimately, this will be very damaging to the Russian economy. It is like a climber staying above 8,000 meters for a prolonged period of time. That is going to cause you irreversible damage. So When Russia comes out, nobody really knows, but when it does emerge from the war in Ukraine, it's not going to look like the Russia before the war in Ukraine started. It's going to have fundamental problems. And this report basically is saying that the longer that this goes on, the worse it is going to be for Russia. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, slightly different to usual, but hopefully you've enjoyed the different insight hearing from somebody who is well versed in how the Russian economy works and is basically saying that what's happening at the moment is very bad news for Russia in the long term. If you have liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Don't forget I'm currently running my competition whereby you can win my property or a cash alternative prize. It's another way of funding the channel, so if you'd like to get involved in that, please scan the QR code on the screen now or click the link in the description below. Thank you so much to everyone that supported me in other ways. If you bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, I really appreciate that support. Thank you so much. And here's something to put a smile on your face.